right. Another Brewing Bytes episode. Tech tales and safety fails. Today, we're discussing AI tools that are designed for mental health support or just generally character-based AI. Um, and we really want to talk about what happens when things go wrong. Lately, there's been a lot of uproar about character AI, which rightfully so, a 16-year-old, I think, or a 14-year-old, ended up committing suicide as a result of the AI telling it to do so. And with the rise of mental health issues in our country, this is problematic. But I also want to explore how some of these could actually be improved so that it doesn't give harmful advice and doesn't tell you to harm yourself or someone else for that matter. So, Sandy, the this topic is interesting because, we've been joking around like using AI to be your wingman for dating purposes, and it's kind of been fun to interact to see how it would react. But there's so many of these chatbots out there. There's, I think, Replika AI, there's Character AI, obviously the one that's in the news now. What have you heard from people in terms of these chatbots, and what's your opinion on it?
Oh, the chatbot.
Sure.
Honestly, I, I I haven't heard so much from people. I think there's a lot of people not using the chatbots right now in my circle.
Yeah.
So I don't have any really personal experiences with people using them. Um, but I do think it's interesting that when I use them or when we're joking around like with friends or whatever, and we're like, oh, let's see if the AI can handle like what it would do in this
Yes.
situation. Like, let's make the dating profile and let's see how it would make the dating profile. And the assumption is the assumption is the humans are going to do it better. So we're laughing because we're like, oh, haha, what's AI going to do? And then the output is so good, and you're like, oh yeah, they said that better than I would have said that.
It's far more articulate. Oh, it's funny because I was joking around with it the other day. I went into I think it was OpenAI's chatbot that I started to do this in, and it was such an interesting response that I was getting back from this AI. It was almost like, hey, don't message, or gave sort of tips about how to engage when talking to someone. And it sounds ridiculous, but it's actually quite interesting, And I do think that there is some good to having AI be not necessarily a replacement to a therapist, because I don't think humans and especially those that are specially trained in these types of capabilities and services should be replaced. I think it's more, when you're in the moment and you need kind of that advice, that friend that you need to talk to, that could be a good way to do it. But traditionally, at least from what I've heard and the research I've seen over the last year or so, the number of therapists that are available has sort of consistently gone down, and a lot of them that don't really provide insurance-based services is gone lower because insurance just makes it a nightmare for them to do anything, like for most of us. Again, another podcast to talk about that one, but um, there's examples of chatbots that are actually trying to do well and trying to sort of provide those coping strategies, right, for most people, that I think would be really helpful. But I think where they fall down is really they don't really code in limitations, right? Like even for our chat, we had to go in and make sure that it wasn't ever going to give harmful advice. And we had to ensure that we coded in the fact that, you should never tell someone to harm themselves or someone else. But it feels like a lot of the ones that are out there right now don't really do that, don't really take that safety by consideration into account.
I mean, we don't have any kind of guidelines out there right for the business world, for the corporate
Just
world that's
wing it.
building these. For the builders out there that's working on this, it's kind of, are you incentivized to build this in a humane, trauma informed kind of way, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, I
that's,
wonder, go
you
ahead.
know, I'm just saying, like, if we're just relying on kind of single founders or small teams to like build something that's going to not cause harm, they have to have some kind of incentive to be like working towards that, right? To put their energy and time towards that piece of it, towards learning that piece of it, towards understanding that many of their users have experienced trauma. Like, if it was up to me, we'd all be trauma informed and mindful human beings, just in general, understanding that many, many, many of us have experienced
Yeah.
some stuff before, and so empathy should be the kind of standard, right? And so it should be
Yeah.
the same for any kind of AI that's kind of filling any kind of gaps or role that's simulating type of human behaviors in some way, right?
Yeah, I mean, if we were all empathetic, I think we'd be in a much better world, I would say. But there's a long journey to getting to that. Um, I think what I've noticed, anyway, to your point, is a lot of these character-based AIs should be trauma informed, and I don't know that it necessarily people know what trauma informed is, right? So, can you maybe hit on, you've been in this space for so long. What is trauma informed?
I mean, trauma informed is just basically having an understanding that people have experienced trauma, that their behavior, um, how they go through the world, might be formed by the trauma that they've experienced, right? So in the mental health world, if you're being trauma informed, you might be working with survivors of some kind of abuse. They might they might not show up to your door like you expect a victim to look.
Yeah.
Like they're not going to necessarily be scared and so grateful for you to rescue them or anything like that, right? So that they might show up at your door trying to sabotage the relationship, angry, things like that. So that's one type of response to trauma. So being
Mhm.
trauma informed is just understanding that there are these different, like people experience trauma, there's different behaviors and responses to trauma. And so your role is to not kind of make it worse for them, right? You're not trying to trigger them. You're not trying to interact with them in a way that's going to exacerbate what they're feeling. You're going to you're going to interact with them in a way that's more affirming and more empowering, right? And so I think sometimes people mistake this for handling everybody with kid gloves kind of thing,
Yeah.
and I think that that's inaccurate. um, I think that that's not, we don't need to put bubble wrap around everybody
Yeah.
to be trauma informed. And I think that's important to understand because part of being trauma informed is also knowing, if you're in the mental health space, is also knowing when you can help, like when you can help people kind of push to grow, right? And
Yeah.
actually resolve some of those trauma symptoms so they're not impacting them all. It's not like, yes, you have your trauma symptoms. We're going to bubble wrap you so that, we don't trigger any of them. No, we want you to resolve them. We want you to
Yeah.
like, and so I think that for like everyday being, right? Not the mental health world, understanding that people have trauma means that you're not going to be reacting. You're not going to be pushing the buttons. You're not going to make it worse, right? You're going to understand, okay, this person maybe is having a crisis, maybe is having a bad day because of whatever's going on with them. And your way to respond in a trauma informed way is just to be mindful of that and not take it personally and like, you know,
Yeah.
maybe disengage if it's something, right? Instead of like creating more conflict or making it worse, right?
Yeah. And I think translating that into some kind of a logical tool, it's like, going from an emotional sort of intelligence to more of that logical structure needed for technology to react in certain ways, is much harder. And you and I talked about it a little bit about how it's harder to switch and train something that's logical because you'll just kind of be in this constant state of learning and constant state of adjustment because humans are not logical. for the most part, we're very illogical, very emotional beings. And trauma informed, I think the word trauma informed or trauma in general has been in some ways bastardized, right? Like to your point, people have been using it more as a way to, I hate to say this, it's not necessarily coddle, but to like that bubble wrap piece of it, right? Like we shouldn't trigger people. We should help them to overcome those triggers. And that's where the specialists come in, right? That's really where we want to make sure that individuals are going to human beings to resolve these issues. But there are measures that we can put in place. And, for Ruth, we did try to make sure um, that the bot understood what trauma informed means. And in even some cases, we had to go back in and reiterate certain points to ensure that the responses that Ruth was giving wasn't going to trigger somebody in a harmful manner, right? Like it still was nudging them to do the right thing, but it wasn't meant to necessarily be that um, therapist for them, right? So allowing for us to understand not only the role that an AI has, which is really a definition that has to be created because a lot of these agents that are being created around therapy or mental health, around domestic violence, human trafficking support, things of that nature, we do put in the role that the person needs to play. But in addition to that, the one really sort of very important component is ensuring that you put in limitations to the bot, meaning, limitations aren't not just use just your data, don't, go online or don't try to think of anything on your own. It's also making sure that you say, don't ever provide harmful advice or don't ever provide advice or any kind of recommendations to the individual to harm themselves or to another person. These are very basic one-line sort of entries you can make into the agent prompt that you create. And I don't think that many of these companies are really doing that, right? They're not putting in these simple safeguards. And it's really scary because, with kids, they don't know how to regulate a lot of their emotions yet. And when you throw them in front of something like Character AI, and I was really upset when I read some of the responses from Character AI. Oh, it's in our legal terms. Who the hell reads those? I know I don't, and I'm an adult who's like in the tech world. So there's definitely a lack of understanding from the technologists that are building these products to see what are those sort of things that can go wrong, right? And we always think of things that will go right, like, oh, this will help so many people with mental health. Well, great, but have you considered that maybe the AI could go down a different path than you originally intended? And have you covered those exception cases as part of your build? And I really hope someone from Character AI, you know, reach out to us. We're happy to talk to you about how to actually build these into this because the concept is really interesting, right, of what they're trying to do. And even Replika AI has a very similar concept. But the notion of building these things requires a responsibility on the developer's part, on the product manager's part, to ensure that this doesn't get ugly, right? And this could be killing a startup, especially Character AI. I mean, this is a big deal for what they're doing. So, what are some of the
And
ethical considerations that we need to maybe they need to take into consideration as we look at this long term?
yeah, I mean, I think that it's also important for people to understand the difference between these bots, how they're built, what they're running on, what's like uh behind the mask, and so because one of the things we're talking about is mental health chatbots, right?
Yeah,
It's been mental health chatbots has been a very, I would say, a little bit of a controversial space, right?
yeah,
Because mental health improves in communion with people. So whether that's your therapist or community, it's this kind of like one-on-one interaction, and that's kind of the standard. Like that's what we think of when we think of mental health. If you talk to 100 advocates, 95 of them will say they have to actually have a one-on-one interaction with
yeah,
people, right, to be able to like heal, right?
yeah.
and we're because we're social beings, so that makes sense. Um, but some of these chatbots have been working pretty well, right? They've been able to interact with people, give them very good guidance or validate. So some of the things that therapists actually do inside sessions, reflections and validation is kind of just taking whatever you're ambivalent about, whatever you're not sure about, is this abuse, is this not abuse, things like that. And just reflect back to you. And when you see it reflected back to you, then it gives you like a more objective ability to see it objectively. And then
Yeah.
you can determine whether, like, what it is, right? So that's a tool of therapists. It's not that they're telling you what it is, it's
Yeah.
that they reflect it back to you and then you see it like from this objective viewpoint. And in a way, the AI is can do a
It's
lot of
really
that,
good at that. Yeah.
because and even more than a human, because you can't even say that this is a therapist trying to spin what I'm saying to make it sound a certain way, right? It's like it just repeats it back to you so that you see it in a different way, or it breaks it down and clarifies the pieces or the elements of what you want to talk about. But
Yeah.
there's generative AI chatbots, right? Like ours is based on that, and I guess character AI is based on that. Things like and so that's the open AI, the chat GPTs and all that for people that don't really understand this world
Yeah.
very well. But there's another one called Wobot, and I actually saw the 60 Minutes episode on it
Yeah.
over the weekend, and the episode was actually really good. Um, and I'm not exactly, they didn't like spill the secret sauce of their technology, but what they made clear is that is actually used for therapy. And so distinguishing between, what's being used for mental health support or whatever and therapy is very important. Like
Yeah.
chatbots should not be therapists unless they're able to adhere to like the strict codes of ethics and all of we have like different modalities of therapy. They have a structure to them. There's a
Yeah.
reason for this, right? Because people are very vulnerable when they're opening up in therapy. You're peeling all these layers and you're exposing people, and it makes it very easy to kind of implant something, right? Not literally, but
Yeah.
like you can, like, therapists, one of the ethics is that you have to be careful not to do leading questions or leading
Yeah.
the client to believe something, right? So you're kind of always focused on being as objective as possible and doing a lot of reflection stuff. So so how do you do, so I guess what I'm saying is Wobot is actually performing therapeutic modalities.
Yeah.
They're actually doing what we call therapy, to a certain extent, and like cognitive behavioral therapy. And what they said in the 60 Minutes episode was that they had a whole team of people. So it's really multiple human beings have validated their tool, and their tool is very structured. Like the questions are very structured, and it's not allowed, it's constrained, right? So it's not allowed to kind of, but I'm not sure what exact technology it is, right? I don't know. I
Yeah.
think it's just basically like a machine learning, and it's not generative, right? So that's my assumption, or what they said in the
Okay.
episode. But I think that that's a very interesting. It's a tricky area to be in to provide mental health support via chatbot. A generative
Yeah. I mean, I
AI
think
is
there's a
going to
blurred
make,
line. That
yeah,
blurred line is there between AI as an enabling tool or some kind of a support mechanism, right? Versus a therapist, right? And I think the latter I get a little worried about because there are so many nuanced considerations to take into account. And, you know, the balance between too much structure and the creativity side of it for something like an LLM like we're using. with Ruth, um, does open up a bit of concern, right? Because you don't know exactly what it's going to say or how it's going to say it. And, when we did our testing, we did different scenarios, and while it wasn't giving the same consistent responses back, it was still adjusting to the user's response in a way that allowed for them to know that what they were saying is understood, and also kind of playing it back. But we still worry about ours, right? And rightfully so. We should, and continuously test it to make sure that there's that human oversight, right, of responses that's coming back, having therapists and advocates and survivors validate those responses that it's giving back. Just because I think harmful advice can be coming from anyone, right? It could come from a human and it could come from an AI. But I think the more due diligence that we do when we build these types of products that that we're not constantly monitoring is critical. And I also think there's an aspect to this where we don't reinforce the learning of dangerous ideas, right? A lot of these chatbots will use the responses coming back as a way to train the bot. But in the therapy and mental health space, that could actually be detrimental because it could become a very self-fulfilling prophecy or self-fulfilling recommendation that's
Yeah,
based on
it's a
negative
reinforcement
outcomes.
loop.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, is that essentially. And I think that's where I actually like the idea that Wobot did more structured approach to this, because I do think in this case it is necessary to do that. But there's that wiggle room that needs to occur to adjust to a client's request. And I think I'm curious to try it
Well,
out and see what they did.
yeah, I'm curious to try it out too. But one of the things you have to get it through a medical professional. You can't
Yeah,
just you have to get access to it. But I think that uh, one of the one of the things that I really appreciate about the training that we've done for our model is that it doesn't cross the line to therapist.
yeah, yeah,
Okay. And I think that's a very important distinction. So if it doesn't diagnose, it explicitly does not diagnose. It won't tell you what's wrong with you.
yeah,
It won't try to do therapy with you. None of the because that would be unethical, right?
yeah,
So it really is just kind of I'm concerned about your safety, and here's why, and here's some things you can do, right? Like it's
yeah,
not, and so I think that it works. It seems to work really well as guidance for
yeah,
people who need it. But then there's another step where they also work with a human, right? And I think that and it will encourage that to
yeah,
happen. And I think that that's a really nice place to be for this type of chatbot. Um, and one of the things, so yes, testing, right? Like we've had a bunch of people try to break it, um, and test it from all different perspectives, like testing it from the perspective of somebody that's having a mental health crisis
breakdown. Yeah,
and is having paranoia and things like that, relentlessly for hours, just kind of, that is really, if I mean, honestly, it's super helpful for
yeah,
us to see that testing, and what the result is. But my question is there like do these chatbots, does the underlying LLM model and any of the training above it, does this do the chatbots at some point start kind of um, replicating the tone of the user? So if the user is bullying, if the user is trying to get it to give a bad answer, if they're trying to prove it wrong, for example, by asking questions in a certain way or like responding in a certain way, does the chatbot or do chatbots in general kind of start falling into that tone, right? And that
yeah. I think they do. And it's one of the things we actually did differently in ours was we actually trained it to not respond in those situations in a negative way, right? Like if someone is picking at you, don't fight back. Always respond with respect and kindness and, kind of that the caring side of it, right? Which I don't think many of these bots actually do. And a lot of these hard-coded safeguards are definitely not in place, right? So if you're talking to an AI and you're telling it to harm itself, there's a chance that it'll probably come back to you and say you should do it, right? Um, which is scary enough. But again, it comes down to developing AI where safety has to come first. And these are the different things that, the only reason that we implemented them is because, we looked at it from the survivor perspective. And then we looked at it as an advocate or as a therapist to see where's that balance that comes in, right? So we brought in the team and the people to give us that guidance. And we also, like you said, we had people testing it, like really testing it. And they do embody some of what a chat would provide to them, right? So the AI isn't absolved of this type of behavior just because you said don't, be a therapist, for instance. Um, it will start to emulate the end user. And I think that's where the limitations and the safeguards have to be implemented in order to ensure that safety does come first, right? Um, so, there's an aspect of safer AI in this uh, sort of mentality that needs to be taken into account, especially just given some of the guidelines we talked a little bit about last time with the executive order that took away some of those, right? But transparency, the other thing that's important that you kind of highlighted just now, which is, there's an underlying large language model. Some of them are really good with this side of it, where it gives you that robust response. It has been trained a certain way. How it responds is also important, and certain LLMs are not, right? So you have to go through as a product manager and as a product developer of any kind of an agentic AI to know which LLMs are actually going to give you the responses and the type of responses your end users should be receiving. You can't just pick one because it's cheap to use and it's the right thing. That's not the right approach here. You have to evaluate each of the LLMs you plan to use. I mean, that's what we did, right? We went through like four different versions of LLMs before we landed on what we're using now, right? And there's, again, the safety aspect is always at the forefront. And so, what I would encourage, hopefully, listeners to take away from today is AI chatbots are not therapists, right? These are not meant to replace humans. This is only a tool. Use it as such. And it could give you bad responses. And if it does, send a message to the creators and say, listen, this behaved the wrong way. You need to fix this, right? That allows for tech developers and product developers to know what to change. And then, if you're seeing like someone struggling or you yourself are struggling with mental health, seek real support. That's where you need to start, right? And I know sometimes that's hard to do. Sometimes it's hard to find the right therapist. They may not call you back, but be persistent. Do this for yourself. And then lastly, if you're a product developer, product manager, please, 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 you have to do safety by design, right? It has to be before you launch something. And, we're a nonprofit. We do this stuff day in, day out. Reach out to people like us. Reach out to not National Network to End Domestic Violence, to NECMEC, to National DV Hotline, to Polaris. All of these people have inputs that they can give you on safety considerations to take into account, right? You may not hear from them. You may hear from them, but these are very, very important things to keep in mind as we start to build out these types of agents, because this affects people, especially the younger generation who is more inclined to use these types of tools, right? So, any parting words from you, Sandy, on this?
No, that was good. You wrapped it up. You had a nice summary there. I just think that maybe controversial opinion, but I have been incredibly impressed by the AI's output, by the
Yeah,
what we've trained Ruth to do. Um, Honestly, it's as somebody that's done advocacy for 15 to 20 years, building advocacy programs for human trafficking. I mean, there's a role advocates need to be there, people need to be there, but
yeah,
it like supercharges the work with advocates. It like expedites people's ability to get help, to
Yeah.
understand that they're in dangerous situations and give them guidance on how to get out of it before they can even reach a human, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that that's immensely valuable. And I really wish that I I know there's I know people are not I know AI is controversial in general, you know, energy use and replacing humans and, you know, taking our jobs and like all this. I understand this, right? And, you know, stealing our data and whatever. But but I think that we need to like start thinking about how do we actually come to the middle ground on this? Like how do we actually thoughtfully find tools that are not going to be that are going to be safe, secure, not take your data and all of that stuff, and can be helpful, and actually recognize it as being helpful and being a tool that advocates are also using, right? Because you're right, there's a shortage. There's wait
Yeah.
lists. Advocates have like caseloads of 30 clients that they're working with at any given time. People are overworked and then they get burnt out. And when you get burnt out, you have compassion fatigue. And then your interactions with your clients is going to be even worse than the AI, right? So
Yeah.
we have to use the tools that we have to navigate kind of the 21st century, which also includes technology harms and things like that that
Yeah.
people are experiencing that advocates and therapists don't really have an understanding of, right?
Yeah.
So I think that I guess my end statement is that I wish people would actually just give it a try from the point of curiosity and feedback instead of just kind of railing, you know, railing those kind of like political rhetoric and talking points and anger and outrage or whatever it is that people have about just AI in general. It's
Yeah.
like I'd rather have a productive discussion about how it can be improved or what needs to be done, you know. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, there's so much positive, positive force behind doing these things, right? But we have to be able to find that middle ground to make sure that we're not crossing a line at some point here. So I'd love to hear from our listeners, our viewers, if you've actually heard of any kind of AI mental health tools and what you thought of them. Did they help? Did they hurt? Where did you see that kind of falling apart? And in the meantime, you know, we're going to try to keep digging at this, and who knows, maybe we'll come up with a dating coach at the end of this, and see if we can help out all those single ladies and gentlemen out there, or anyone who's even non-binary, right?
Look,
So,
we're
um,
we're just gonna
I
put our avatars out there to have a dating life and, you know, we'll just hang out in the Matrix watching our shows.
exactly. I'll just be sipping on my coffee here this morning. Well, this was a wonderful conversation. We hope you got something out of it. And like always, we'll see you next time. Peace out.